Venice, July 1947. A British military court. The judges had deliberated. The verdict was ready. The man in the dock had commanded German forces in Italy for 2 years. He had held the Allied advance for longer than anyone had thought possible. Now he was being sentenced to death. Albert Kesselring, Luftwaffe Field Marshal, the man the Allies had nicknamed Smiling Albert. When the death sentence was read, he looked at the judges. The observers in the courtroom documented what happened next. He smiled. 8 years later, he was having lunch in Germany. The death sentence was gone. The conviction remained on paper but had no practical meaning. He was a free man in a spa town writing his memoirs. The 335 people whose deaths had put him in that dock were still dead. Outside Rome there are caves. On March 24 every year the families come. They have been coming since 1945. They come because 335 people were taken inside those caves on March 24, 1944 and shot. The entrance was then sealed with explosives. Albert Kesselring signed the order. Albert Kesselring, born 1885 in Bavaria, career military officer. He transferred from the army to the Luftwaffe in 1933 and rose quickly. By 1940 he was commanding air fleets over Poland, France, and Britain. By 1941 he was Commander-in-Chief South, responsible for the entire Mediterranean theater. By 1943, he was the man holding Italy against an Allied advance that had superior numbers, superior air power, and superior supply. Italy was not supposed to be difficult. The Allied command had expected to move quickly up the peninsula after the landings in Sicily in July 1943. Kesselring had other plans. He understood the terrain in a way his superiors in Berlin initially dismissed. The mountains and rivers of central Italy were natural defensive lines. He intended to use every one of them. The Gustav Line, the Winter Line, Monte Cassino, Anzio, each one cost the Allies months and thousands of casualties. Allied commanders who faced him in the field documented their frustration in something else, a grudging respect for the quality of the defense being mounted against them. Field Marshal Alexander wrote that Kesselring was the best German general he had faced. He meant it as an assessment, not a compliment. The Allied assessments of Kesselring are documented in the National Archives at Kew. They are consistent, professional, skilled, effective. The man running the Italian campaign for Germany was not making mistakes. He was making the correct decisions with the resources available to him and making the Allies pay for every kilometer. That assessment would complicate what came after the war. The same men who wrote those reports would later sign something else entirely. Rome, March 23, 1944. The Via Rasella. An Italian partisan unit detonated a bomb concealed in a rubbish cart as a column of German police troops marched past. 33 German soldiers were killed. 11 more died from their wounds in the following days. The total German death toll reached 33 by the official count. The reprisal calculation began immediately. Hitler's standing order was clear and had been in place for years. For every German soldier killed by partisans or resistance fighters in occupied territory, 10 civilians were to be executed in reprisal. The order was not discretionary. It was a Führerbefehl, a direct order from Hitler, and it had been implemented across occupied Europe. The chain of command that received the Via Rasella report understood what the order required. The order that emerged from the German command chain specified the ratio: 10 Italian civilians for every German soldier killed. 33 soldiers, 330 Italian civilians. The calculation was precise. The documentation shows the number was later revised upward. In the final implementation, it was 335. The additional 5 were added from a list of prisoners already scheduled for execution. The total was 335. Kesselring's authority covered the command structure that issued the order. The question at trial would be whether his authority made him responsible for what the order required. The Ardeatine Caves were an ancient quarry system outside the Aurelian Wall south of Rome. On the afternoon of March 24, 1944, trucks arrived. The prisoners were brought in groups of 5. They were made to kneel. They were shot in the back of the head. The executions took several hours. When it was finished, the entrance to the caves was sealed with explosive charges. The Germans intended that no one would find them. 335 people were killed inside those caves on March 24, 1944. They included Jews, political prisoners, resistance fighters, and ordinary Roman citizens who had been in German custody for unrelated reasons. The youngest was 15 years old, the oldest was 74. They were shot in groups in the darkness and left where they fell. The entrance was sealed above them. Rome was liberated on June 4, 1944. Within days, Italian civilians and Allied investigators had located the caves. The sealed entrance was opened. What was found inside became one of the most documented atrocities of the Italian campaign. The identifications took months. The families came from across Rome. By the end of the summer, the identity of most of the 335 had been established. The order that had put them there was in the German command files. The chain of command that had issued it was documented. The families did not stop coming. They came when the caves were first opened. They came when the memorial was established. They came every March 24. What they wanted from the post-war proceedings was not complicated. They wanted the men who had issued the order to be held responsible for what the order required. That expectation would encounter something they had not anticipated. The war in Italy continued for another 13 months after the Ardeatine Caves. Kesselring continued to command the Gothic Line, the Po Valley. He held the Allied advance until the German surrender in Italy on May 2, 1945. He was captured shortly afterward. He had commanded in Italy for almost 2 years. What had happened at the Ardeatine Caves was one documented event in those 2 years. The Allied investigators had the documentation. The trial would determine what it meant. The trial opened in Venice in February 1947. The British military court charged Kesselring on 2 counts. First, ordering the Ardeatine Caves reprisal, an act that violated the laws of war because the ratio of reprisals exceeded what international law permitted, and because civilians not connected to the partisan attack were included among the victims. Second, inciting and ordering his troops to commit war crimes against the Italian civilian population more broadly during the final months of the campaign. Kesselring's defense was consistent and documented. He had not personally issued the order for the Ardeatine Caves reprisal. The order had been processed through the SS and police chain of command, not through his Wehrmacht command structure. He had been informed of the reprisal after the fact. He bore no direct responsibility for the specific implementation. The prosecution's case was that his command authority covered the territory, that the reprisal was carried out by forces operating under his overall command, and that the ratio used violated the laws of war regardless of who processed the specific paperwork. What the trial observers documented consistently was his demeanor. Kesselring sat through the proceedings with composure. He was attentive. He followed the arguments carefully. He showed no visible distress when survivor testimony was read. He showed no visible distress when the forensic evidence from the caves was presented. On May 6, 1947, when the president of the court read the death sentence, the observers in the courtroom noted that he appeared almost unmoved. Several accounts describe a slight smile. He was led back to his cell. The verdict was death by shooting. The court had found him guilty on both counts. The sentence required confirmation by the commander-in-chief of British forces in the Middle East. That confirmation was given. Albert Kesselring had been sentenced to death for his role in the murder of 335 Italian civilians. The date of execution was to be set. It was never set. He was still the man who had received the verdict, who had heard the sentence and smiled. The same composure that had carried him through the Italian campaign, the professional certainty of a man who believed he had operated within the bounds of what was required, had carried him through the trial. It had not left him. The campaign to commute Kesselring's sentence began almost immediately after the verdict. It was not a spontaneous public movement. It was organized, and it involved figures of significant standing. Field Marshal Alexander, the same officer who had commanded the Allied forces in Italy and who had written the assessments praising Kesselring's professional ability, signed a petition supporting commutation. Winston Churchill made representations on his behalf. British and American military figures who had opposed him in the field argued that he had been a professional soldier doing what professional soldiers do. The argument made on his behalf had 2 components. First, the Ardeatine Caves reprisal, while excessive and involving civilians not connected to the partisan attack, fell within a contested area of the laws of war regarding reprisals against civilian populations in occupied territory. This argument was legally contested, but not without some basis in the ambiguity of 1944 international law. Second, Kesselring had conducted the defense of Italy as a professional military operation and had not been personally implicated in the specific implementation of the massacre. The men making this argument knew about the 335. They made it anyway. The death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment in 1947. The life sentence was then reduced to 21 years. In October 1952, Kesselring was released from World Prison in West Germany on grounds of ill health. He had served 5 years. The 335 people in the Ardeatine Caves had been dead for 8 years. He was 67 years old and in poor health. Within a year, he was well enough to accept the honorary presidency of a German veterans organization. The Stahlhelm, the Steel Helmet, one of Germany's oldest veterans organizations. Kesselring accepted the honorary presidency in 1953. The organization represented former German soldiers across both world wars. His acceptance of the role was publicly criticized in Italy and in the international press. In Germany, it was treated as the natural next step for a senior commander who had served his country. The framing in each country was different. The facts were the same. In 1953, Kesselring published his memoirs. The title translates as Soldier to the Last Day. The book describes his career from the First World War through the Italian campaign. It presents him as a professional soldier who served Germany with honor and within the bounds of military law. The Ardeatine Caves appear in the memoirs. He describes the reprisal as a military necessity carried out in response to a terrorist attack in which German soldiers were killed. He expresses no remorse. He does not mention the youngest victim, 15 years old, or the oldest, 74. The book was published and reviewed. It sold well in West Germany. The memoir's treatment of the Italian campaign has been analyzed by historians since publication. The consistent observation is the same. Kesselring presents every decision as professionally justified. The German retreat through Italy as a skilled defensive operation, which it was. The Ardeatine Caves reprisal as a lawful response to partisan violence, which it was not, by the finding of the court that had sentenced him to death. The memoir never acknowledges the verdict as correct. It never acknowledges the families. It never acknowledges what the youngest and oldest victims had done to deserve being in those caves. Kesselring spent his final years in Bad Nauheim, a spa town in Hesse. He continued to be active in veterans circles and to give interviews about the Italian campaign. Italian survivors and families of the Ardeatine Caves victims occasionally attempted to raise the question of his continued freedom and his role in the massacre. The West German government was not receptive. The legal proceedings were concluded. The commutation had been granted by the British military authority. The matter was considered closed. He died on July 16, 1960 in Bad Nauheim. He was 74 years old. He had outlived his death sentence by 13 years. He had outlived the youngest victim of the Ardeatine Caves massacre by 16 years. The youngest victim had been 15 in 1944. He would have been 31 in 1960. Kesselring died of natural causes. His obituaries in the West German press described a distinguished military commander. The Italian press described something else. On March 24, 1960, 3 months before Kesselring died, the families had gathered at the caves for the 16th annual ceremony. They had been coming every year since 1945. The ceremony included the reading of names, 335 names. It took time. Some of the families who had come in 1945 had died themselves in the intervening years. Their children came instead. The caves had been turned into a national memorial in 1949. The entrance where the explosives had been detonated in 1944 was now a formal monument. The names were on the walls inside. The names on the walls are documented, the ages are documented, the dates of arrest and the reasons for detention are documented. Some had been arrested for resistance activity, some had been Jewish. Some had been taken in routine sweeps with no specific charge recorded against them. Some of the families had waited years for the identification to be confirmed. The documentation of who was in those caves and why they were there is one of the most complete records of a reprisal massacre in the history of the Italian campaign. The 1947 Venice Tribunal verdict is in the British National Archives at Kew, WO 235 series, War Crimes Trial Records. The petition for commutation signed by Field Marshal Alexander is in the same archive. The commutation order is documented. The release papers from Worrell Prison are documented. The memoir is published and in libraries. The death certificate from Bad Nauheim is in the German civil records. All of it is in the archive. The question the archive cannot answer is the one the families had been asking since 1944. He never came back to Italy. He never addressed the families. He never acknowledged the verdict as correct. The smile that the courtroom observers documented in May 1947 when the death sentence was read, that was the last public record of his response to what the court had found. 8 years later, he was in Germany. The caves were in Italy. The families were still coming on March 24. The answer to why he was having lunch in Germany 8 years after a death sentence is in the National Archives at Kew. Whether that answer is sufficient is a question the archive was not designed to resolve.